I'm Ken, and I will take you and show you how we make whisky here in the north of Scotland. So good, nice to meet you. Tomatin Distillery, although it's called Tomatin Distillery, it's actually the home of 3 brands you probably already know. So we make the Tomatin Highland Malt Whisky, which is the one that we're making at the moment, and it's the one that you'll mostly concern ourselves with. It's one you're going to see being made. We also make the Kuboken, which is an experimental Highland malt whisky. It's a slightly smoky one, a little bit of peat smoke in it. And we experiment with the type of barrels that we put that in to create quite unique different flavours of whisky. And we also make the Antiquary, which is a blended whisky. And you'll know that all of the big names in Scotch are blends, Johnny Walkers and Bells and that sort of thing. So the Antiquary is our sort of answer to that. The name of the distillery, Tomatin, is a Gaelic word. I understand that in Spanish it actually means small tomato, but here in Scotland in the Gaelic it means hill of the juniper. So you find juniper bushes growing in the hills around here, and juniper bushes are much more associated with gin making than whisky. Gin gets its name and its flavour from the juniper bush, but we've been distilling whisky here since way back in the 1500s, when it was very much against the law and you had to keep it hidden. We didn't not make it, we just had to be very secretive about it. And there was a hunting lodge here back in the 1500s, and they had an illicit still. Now they would have hidden their still over there in the woodland somewhere, so that they could say it's not mine if the authorities came knocking on the door. And it would be close enough though that they could get to the spirit. The beauty of juniper bushes are that when you burn them, they don't give off smoke. So burning junipers were used in those days to heat the stills, and that way they were kept hidden and no one knew they were there. And this is what they were making back then. This is what in Gaelic they would have called ushkava, which translates as the water of life, aqua vitae or eau de vie. And they held it in pretty high esteem, but that was actually been very much like moonshine back then. And they made it for visitors to the area. So if you came here, if you were hunting deer, then you would get a wee glass of that, and that would help keep you warm while you were out in the wilds. Back in the 1800s, Victorian Britons used to drink a lot of brandy, but there had been problems throughout that century for one reason and another that meant there wasn't enough wine to make enough brandy for everyone. And that's when they started to drink whisky instead, which was great news for Scotland. And in 1897, 3 businessmen from Inverness decided to build a distillery here at Tomatin. And they chose the spot because there's a little river that runs down through the side of it there. And that meant that they could take all the water from the river and put that into the whisky. So that is the source for Tomatin whisky. It's called the Alt na Fray in Gaelic, or the free burn in English. But another major reason for building the distillery up here in the middle of the mountains was the railway line that runs through the middle of it. It allowed them to gather the ingredients by train and send the whisky off around the world. The one problem in building the distillery here in effectively the middle of nowhere, no one lived here back in the 1890s, so throughout the years they built all the houses to encourage people to come and stay here. And that's fairly unique. We have a very high number of staff living on site. More than half of the staff live over there, which is great news for the staff. The staff here at Tomatin, they finish work at 1 o'clock on a Friday, and they can be home for the weekend by 1 minute past 1. And you don't want to get in their way because they just come trooping out of here when the wee alarm goes and straight across the bridge and home for the weekend. But equally from the distillery's point of view, if you live just there, you have no excuse for being late in the morning. So we make sure that our staff are always here on time. Now the reason that you can see the distillery, you'll see that it's quite physically a large place. It used to be the biggest distillery in Scotland back in the 1970s. And we used to produce close to 13 million litres of alcohol every single year. And the thrust of that business was to sell it to the blenders, the likes of Johnny Walkers and Bells and Dewars. And we were getting on really well with that, so supplying about 30 different blends with our malt. In the 1980s, the whisky market, like a lot, was hit by the recession, and that meant we were basically 30 times worse off than anyone else. So we were left with a lot of spirit that we couldn't sell and a bit of a cash flow problem. But we were lucky because there was a group of Japanese businessmen who loved Tomatin whisky and didn't want to see it disappear. And they realised that the way they could make sure there was a supply of Tomatin malt for themselves was by stepping in and buying the whole distillery. So now it belongs to the Takara Shusu company of Japan, and it has done since 1986. Now we're going to go inside and show you how you make whisky. The 3 main ingredients are water, which we talked about, coming from the river. There is yeast and malted barley, and this is where we store the barley. So if you come inside, I'll introduce you to that. There's 500 tonnes of malted barley in here, and that's enough to keep the distillery going for about 4 weeks. The malting of the barley is a process that it goes through before it arrives here, and it's what gives the whisky the name malt Scotch whisky. When the barley is harvested, we use Scottish barley, so all our barley is grown in this country and it's actually being harvested round about now. So if you're out in the fields, you'll see the combines. And once the barley is harvested, it looks like that. It goes along to a place called the Maltings, and the one that we use is called Simpson's, and they're based down in the border town of Berwick-on-Tweed. And at the Maltings, what they do is they steep the barley in warm water to sort of waken it up. It thinks it's raining when they do that, so it thinks it's springtime, time to start growing. So it starts to grow a little bit, and then they drop it down onto the floor of a huge big warehouse. This is a big circular building, and the grain in that photograph is above head height. So the barley is allowed to germinate or grow for a few days in here. While it's in here, the floor just revolves slowly, and the barley gets raked by these posts to keep it moving, to stop it all sticking together. And then after 4 or 5 days germination, they move it across here into the kiln, where they turn the heat up and dry it out. And once it's dried out, this is now called malt. And this is the standard malt that we use for the majority of the whiskies we produce at Tomatin. All of the Tomatin Highland single malt whiskies are made with this. If you have a little sniff of it, you'll see it's got a nice kind of grassy farmyard sort of smell. If you want to just pass it round, then you can have a little sniff at that. Now, you'll know about whiskies that get described as being smoky. These are ones like Talisker and Laphroaig and Lagavulin and Highland Park. They're associated mostly with the much more remote parts of the Highlands than we are here. And the reason they're smoky is historical. If you're kilning the barley here, you need a lot of heat to dry it out. And they get the heat by burning this. This is a piece of peat, which torf, or maybe torb. It's quite an abundant fuel. You find this lying in the ground in Scotland, and you scoop it out and dry it, and it burns very well. So if you're living on an island, there's no point in importing expensive coal when you can just go outside and you can dig this out of your garden and not pay anyone for it. So that's the fuel they used. If you have a little sniff, you'll see it doesn't have any odour as it stands like that. But when you burn it, it gives off a very strong smoke, which we call the peat reek. And this here is some barley that's been malted with peat smoke blown through it. And if you have a wee sniff of that, you'll see this jar is going to make very different whisky, and that's where that smokiness comes from. And we use the peated barley like this when we're making Kubokken whisky. And we make Kubokken every December. Roughly for a couple of weeks in December, this stops being the Tomatin distillery and becomes the Kubokken distillery. And we concentrate on producing our Highland single malt with the wisps of smoke in it. And we experiment with producing different flavours of that due to the different casks that we'll see when we go around. And we make about 130,000 bottles of Kubokken whisky every single year. Now, once we've got the barley, what we do is we put it through a mill, like this one in the little sketch here. There's two sets of rollers in the mill which turn round and they crush it. This comes out underneath, and this is what we call grist. And the important part of the grist for us is the white flour you can see in here. This is the starch that was released during that process. And the starch gets turned into sugar next, and then the sugar is fermented to give us the alcohol. So now that we've got 9 tons of grist, we need to add lots of water from the Altnaffray burn to it. And I'll show you how we do that just through here. Now, we don't use this one anymore, obviously, because it's got a big hole in the side of it. We have a working one upstairs, and that's the one that we use for making whisky at the moment. But we cut a hole in this one, which was basically a spare. These machines here, these tanks here, these are called washbacks, and the liquid that's produced in here is called wash. And wash is basically strong beer. Whisky is really just beer that's been distilled. You make beer and then you distill it to make it stronger, and it's only really a Scotsman that could come up with that idea. So the wort comes through from next door in this pipe, and they attach a hose from here to the side of the tank, and it fills slowly from the basement up. Now, when the wort is about 1 meter's depth in the bottom of this tank, this huge big tank, we put the yeast in it. We put 120 kilograms of yeast into a tank this size. We throw it in through the top. It's called pitching the yeast. You throw the yeast in there, it falls down into the liquid. And when it goes in here, the yeast is sort of asleep to start with, and it spends a few hours settling itself in and wakening up and settling into the new environment. It then starts to reproduce, and the yeast goes through 2 generations. So we've got 120 kilograms of yeast in here. That produces 240, then 480 kilograms. And all the while it's reproducing, it's using up all the oxygen in the tank. It gets very violent in here when the yeast sets to work. You get a lot of foam produced. You imagine when you're pouring a pint of beer and you get a wee foam head at the top. You get 42,500 times as much foam produced here. So although these lids are quite heavy, they do have to be fastened down very tightly, or they would be forced open and the liquid would spray out all over the place. This is why the floor's like this. If it spills, it drains off downstairs. It doesn't leave you with a slippery surface, and it's not just to be scary to stand on. That's a bonus. When the foam gets to the top of the tank, it triggers this sensor, which turns that motor on, and inside you'll see there a sort of fan blade called a switcher, and it spins round, it chops the head off the foam, and it releases the carbon dioxide out through the overflow pipe. Once the yeast is used up, all the oxygen in here, no more fresh air can get in because it's all sealed, and when yeast runs out of oxygen, it stops reproducing. It then starts to turn sugar into alcohol, and that of course is the important bit for us. And the whole process of fermentation at Tomatin lasts around about 54 hours, so just a bit more than 2 days. And in that time the yeast's done its job. It's turned all the sugar to alcohol, it's used up all the food and all the oxygen in the tank though, and the temperature rises from 20 degrees to about 33. It gets a little bit acidic in here as well, and all in all, after 54 hours, this tank's not a very nice place for the yeast to be, and yeast sadly dies at the end of this process. It sacrifices itself to make good strong whiskey for us, so we usually just have a wee moment's silence to remember the yeast at this point in the tour. But if you went to a brewery, as I say, you see a room very similar to this, and we're basically making beer. Brewers will take the yeast out before it dies, and they can use the same batch of yeast several times over. We end up with a beer that we call wash, and it's about 10% alcohol by volume. So strong for beer, but not strong enough yet for whiskey. So now we have to take it to the still house and start removing the water from it. So the wash comes through on the pipe on the ceiling here, and it goes into the black box there. It's called a wash charger. We heat it up a little bit in there, and then we put it into the copper pot stills. And these are just basically giant kettles, big copper kettles. And the only thing inside there is the heating element. There's a pipe with steam in it. And we put 14,000 litres of wash into each of these stills, and we heat them up to 90 degrees Celsius. It's quite important that they don't boil. The shape of the still is absolutely critical. The shape of the still defines the character or flavour of the spirit that's produced. And at the end of the day, different shapes of still produce different flavours of whiskey. There's about 120 malt distilleries in Scotland, and if you go around every single one of them, you won't see another still exactly the same shape and size as that. There are variations on the theme. Sometimes they're taller than this, sometimes they're shorter, wider, narrower, flatter, rounder, or whatever. And no two precisely the same, because every distillery thinks they've got the right shape to make the best whiskey. And of course all the other distilleries are wrong in thinking that, because we have the right shape here. But what happens at 90 degrees is the alcohol vaporizes in here and rises up through the head of the still, this vertical bit. Some of it cools at the top, and the liquid pours back down the sides into this bulb in the middle, which is called a reflux chamber. And in there it gets a wee boost from the next lot of vapour, and it goes off, up and round again. And it might go round 2 or 3 times, and each time it goes round it's interacting more with the copper. The copper acts as a catalyst for the chemical processes, so the flavour develops that way. And also each time it goes round it's being refluxed or redistilled, so it's leaving more water behind and it's becoming more concentrated in alcohol and a little bit lighter in weight. Eventually it's light enough to get all the way to the top of the head, go round the little curve there, that's called a swan neck, and then across this horizontal pipe, which is called a line arm, till it passes outside. Once it goes outside, it's going into one of these. This is called a shell and tube condenser. Now there's one of these for each still, and these are mounted vertically around the outside of the building. This end is the top. This pipe here, made of copper again, attaches to the line arm up there. The hot alcohol vapour goes into the top of the condenser. Cold water from the river is pushed in the bottom and goes up through all these little copper tubes you can see inside here. And as the cold water goes up through the pipes, the vapour passes between them and it condenses on the cold pipework. So this is a little bit like boiling a kettle next to a window and getting condensation running down the glass. So the condensation runs down and pours out of this pipe here. And from this first distillation, the liquid that comes out of here is called low wines, and it's now about 25% alcohol by volume. So stronger than it was, but not strong enough yet for Scotch whisky. So we take it to the other side of the room and we distill it for a second time in the second set of stills there. The spirit that comes from the still looks like this, clear liquid. It gets put into oak barrels like these ones, and we leave it there for at least 3 years to make it into Scotch whisky. You can't take it out of the barrel before the 3 years is up. And when it comes out of the barrel, you'll see that it's got a nice kind of brown colour, and that comes from the oak. We use a lot of barrels like these ones that have come second-hand from the States. These are ex-bourbon barrels, and in America, when you're making bourbon, you have to mature it for 2 years, but it must go into a brand new barrel. You can't make a batch of Wild Turkey bourbon, 2 years later bottle it and then refill the barrels to make more. You've got to get rid of those and bring in fresh ones. So we take all the second-hand barrels. We also, quite unusually at a Scotch distillery, use virgin oak barrels, and a virgin oak barrel is a brand new one that's had no spirit in it before. And we put the whisky into that. It comes out very dark brown because of the tannin in the woods, basically the colouring that you get in tea. And it's quite a sweet liquid that comes out of a brand new bourbon barrel as well. So we can create quite dark, quite sweet, quite nutty flavoured whiskies in quite a short period of time by using the bourbon barrel. Once the barrels are filled, they go off to the warehouses and they don't see the light of day for the legal minimum of 3 years. And we're going to go into one of the warehouses just now and we'll see some of the 170,000 barrels of whisky that we have here on site at Tomatin. In all of the various big warehouses. So we'll go into the one just across the road here though and see some barrels that have that whisky in them. This is warehouse number 6. This is one of the oldest warehouses at Tomatin. It's been here since the very early days of the distillery, so it's well over 100 years old. And it's what we call a dunnage warehouse. We've got 2 types of warehouses. The ones that you see when you came into the distillery, big, huge, tall buildings, enormously long buildings, they're called racked warehouses, and the barrels are stacked on metal racks in those. These are called dunnage because this wooden beam's called a dun, and that's where it gets its name from. And there's close to, as I say, 170,000 barrels of whisky on site here at Tomatin. And over the whole of Scotland today, there will be 20 million barrels of whisky maturing. And that's 4 times the population. So there's 4 barrels for every man, woman and child in the country. These ones here are mine, you can't have them. But when you come in here, you'll notice that it's quite cold. It's cooler inside than outside, and that's because the warehouses are built with very thick walls and not very many windows. So sunlight doesn't get in here and it doesn't get warmer than this. The barrels are resting on the earth as well, there's no floor, so moisture gets in from the outside. And that's the best way for maturing whisky, because once you put whisky into a barrel here, it will evaporate through the pores in the wood. You lose up to 2% of the contents of each barrel every year due to that evaporation. This is what's known as the angel's share of the whisky, because it's said to go off into the sky, and the angels are presumably having a big party there. But it's the reason why when you come in here, there's quite a nice smell of whisky in the air. It's also the reason why when whisky gets older, it gets so very, very expensive. There's literally not much of it left. This is the oldest whisky we have at Tomatin from 1967, and it was filled to the top back then. And in the last 50 years, the level has realistically dropped all the way down to probably about here. So there's some whisky there, but up there, it's virtually hollow. And we produced a barrel of this last year, just before Christmas last year. We bottled a barrel of this and it yielded 70 bottles. So that was about 49 litres. And these bottles went on sale 2 weeks before Christmas last year, Monday morning, £10,000 each. And by Thursday, we'd sold all but a handful of them. They've all gone now. If you want to buy one of these now, I think they're changing hands for around about £14,000. So if you want to write out a wee check, I'll get a hold of one for you. Whisky can be a good investment. Generally, if you can afford to buy, say, a £1,000 bottle of whisky when you're in your 20s, by the time you retire, if you keep it, it could be worth £10,000 or perhaps more than that. The only problem is 50 years of temptation. You come home every night from work and it's sitting on the shelf there saying, drink me. The best idea is always to buy 2 bottles at a time. You lock one away where you can't find it and you drink and enjoy the other one. And just to show you what that angel's share looks like, actually, if you come to this barrel here, which was distilled in 2007, and it was filled right to the top. And that big gap at the top there, that's the angel's share. So that's gone into the sky and the angels have just partied on with it. So if you've got a barrel of whisky and it's 30 years old, realistically it's going to be half full. So you can see why the price would double after 30 years and then sort of exponentially double again a few years later and again and again. And that's why whisky, as I say, gets expensive. Greedy angels. These barrels here, they've all got whisky in them. They're laid out in order of date, and the idea being when you come in here, you might find a barrel that's got your date of birth on it, and then you can take a wee selfie next to a barrel of whisky that's the same age as you. I'm pretending that I was born in 1985, but really my barrel's way along that end there somewhere. So the 12-year-old single malt is been matured in bourbon and sherry casks for those 12 years. And the number of years is the number of well, the 12 is the number of years that the whiskey's been in a barrel in one of the various warehouses around here. If we keep this for 10 years, it will still be 12-year-old whiskey. As you probably know, it doesn't get older when it's in the bottle. It's only aging when it's in the barrel. And this was matured, about a third of it in what we call first fill bourbon barrels, so the ones that you saw in the cooperage coming from the States. A third in sherry casks, like the ones we saw there as well. And the final third was going into refill casks, ones that have been used before. It's left there for 12 years, and then it's put into the bottle as we have it here. Is they hold their whiskey up like this, and you'll see folks sort of staring at it wistfully. If you see someone doing this in Scotland, what they're doing is they're checking to see how much whiskey's in the glass. They want to see how generous you were when you were pouring it, and then we judge you on that. But if you swirl it around in the glass, you'll see it sort of sticks to the side, it clings to the side of the glass. And this gives you an idea of how much flavour there is in the whiskey. The liquid that went into the barrels, it's very much like water. It gets all of its colour and flavour from what's in the wood, and so the fat in the wood is a little bit oily, so as it's adding colour and flavour, it's making the whiskey slightly sticky. And the more flavour there is, the more it sticks to the side of the glass, and the more slowly these stripes that you can see form. They're called legs. So you can tell by looking at a whiskey if it's likely to have a lot of flavour. You can't tell by looking at it if it's going to taste nice or not. So before you taste the whiskey, what you do is you take the glass to your nose and just breathe gently through your nose at the neck of the glass. Leave your mouth open a little bit when you're doing that. You get a lovely idea what the whiskey will be like. If you have it with your mouth closed, it doesn't quite smell the same, but open your mouth, you've got a lovely rich kind of aroma. And this whiskey has quite a nice kind of festive note to it. It smells a wee bit like a Christmas cake maybe, or a Christmas pudding or something with lots of dried fruit soaked in alcohol and stirred in, a wedding cake or that sort of thing. And also a little bit of toffee there. There's a wee bit of hint of caramel when it comes to tasting it. When you are tasting the whiskey and nosing the whiskey, there's no right or wrong answers. So if you disagree with me, that's fine. Whatever you think it smells and tastes like is right for you. But once you've nosed the whiskey, you've got an idea of what it should taste like. The best way to taste it is to take a nice big generous sip. Hold it on your tongue for a second or two, sort of chew on it a little bit, and you'll get the flavours out that way. Don't slosh it around like wine, because that's just going to burn your cheeks, because it's 3 times the strength of an average glass of wine. Okay, that we're going to taste now is our 18-year-old single malt, and it's just like a sort of older brother of the 12-year-old that you tasted. This one's been 15 years in bourbon casks, and then it's been transferred to Oloroso sherry casks for another 3 years for what we call finishing, so 18 years in total. So a much darker whiskey than the other one was, because the sherry casks have a bit more influence and they're dark, they create dark whiskey, and also just because it's been in the barrel longer, it's going to get a little bit darker. An older whiskey, because it's been in the barrel longer, you expect to have a little bit more flavour, and that kind of usually means that it's a bit more sticky. And you can see that it does actually cling to the glass longer than the 12, and the legs that are forming here take a little bit more time before they start. So you can tell immediately that this is going to be a slightly more flavoursome whiskey. And again, nosing it with your mouth open, and you get a lovely idea of where the flavours are going to come from. The sherry influence stands out on this. You can smell that. You get a kind of sort of raisiny kind of sort of note to it. More, just like the 12, but a little bit more. There's a little bit of soft sort of oak flavour nose in that as well. It's a little bit more nutty or woody than the 12 was. And then when you taste it, as you'll see what you think for yourself of the flavour. This one has, it describes here as a kind of like dark chocolate. So if you imagine you've got a really nice expensive bar of rich dark chocolate, and it's all that kind of intensely sort of fruity notes to it, and that comes across in the whiskey. You can smell that kind of, that richness, and you can taste that richness, and the sort of raisins and sultana kind of flavours come out of it. But with a soft oak sort of background, because it's been a long time in the barrel, and it's taken the sort of nutty woody flavours from the oak, but because it's been in there for 18 years, it's tempered and it's quite soft and quite smooth. 2 different creations each year, and there we can be a bit experimental with the types of barrels that we put in. We have one of our creations that's been in Japanese sochu casks and European virgin oak, which is quite unusual. It's really only very recently that we've been allowed to use Japanese sochu casks to mature Scotch whisky. And then we have this one, and this one is our creation. It's quite a distinctive one. This one has been matured in Black Isle Brewery stout barrels. And Guinness is a sort of stout whisky, and this is a beer rather. And Guinness, this is a sort of Black Isle version of that. The brewery just up north of Inverness makes this stout beer, kind of like Guinness. We get their barrels after they've had their beer in them for a while, and we put the Cabochon in there to create this expression. And it's also been in Muscatel wine casks, Portuguese red Muscatel wine, and that's why it's got this nice sort of reddish colour. So I'll pour these ones and you can have a little sample of these. The biggest difference between this one and the others, of course, is the peat, the little bit of peat smoke. It's not overpoweringly smoky, because there would be no point in using these special barrels if we just put lots of smoke in there. That's all you would taste. So we've got a little hint of peat smoke just to add an extra dimension to it.